to our student-led discussion for Native American Heritage Month. I am Mia Honecker, the Associate Director for the Office of Latinx, Asian, and Native American Affairs, or LANA, as we call it. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for this discussion about the reservation system. This discussion is being held by one of our student leaders, Cameron Hendricks. Cameron has been an amazing addition to the LANA family. He is the Vice President of the Association of Native American Students, and he is in his first year at Wright State, actually his first year and first semester, and majoring in social science education. So let's give a warm Raider welcome to Cameron.
Hello, I'd like to thank you all for being here and welcome you to today's discussion. I'd like to thank the Association of Native American Students for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to thank and embarrass my father for being here, and my mother for getting me interested in my own heritage and the history of indigenous people across the United States and Canada. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge my own biases and limitations. Despite my heritage, which is of the Muskogee Creek Nation, which currently is in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, I've never faced hatred or discrimination because of the color of my skin. I am overwhelmingly white, and I cannot speak firsthand of the hardships and experiences that the people we'll be discussing today suffer. Finally, in discussing the history, which will take up the first part of this discussion, I cannot get into how every single native tribe, of which there are over 500 in the United States, found themselves in this situation. So I'll be focusing mainly on what's known as the 5 civilized tribes, which inhabited the southeast of the United States in the 1830s, which the Creek were a part of, rather than Native Americans as a whole, until we get to the second part of our discussion, talking about the problems that are caused and are faced by on reservations. Keep in mind this is also a discussion. Feel free to ask questions at any point, and I'll do my best to answer them. But as any of you who have studied this topic know, it's a complicated area. So to start with the history, we need to look at pre-Columbian America. So before Christopher Columbus comes to Hispaniola down in the Caribbean, there were about 112 million Native Americans living in anywhere from north of the Rio Grande River in Texas. That would make them about the 12th largest country today in terms of population, and they aren't all just these pastoralist peoples roaming the Great Plains in their headdresses and hunting buffalo. In fact, there's a great amount of diversity between Native American civilizations of this period. You have, of course, pastoralists living in the Great Plains, but you will also have urbanites in the Southwest and some of the harshest conditions. You have complicated democratic societies, such as the Iroquois Confederacy, which by some oral traditions exists 80 years before Christopher Columbus even set sail, and you have farmers and the sorts all across the country. So what you have here are complicated and different groups of people who all inhabit and use the land differently. And just a side note, this is not, this map down here isn't the political territories or boundaries of certain native groups. These are just linguistic areas. Native Americans, with perhaps the exception of the Iroquois Confederacy, didn't exactly see themselves as nation states, rather that the land was held in common and used rather than owned and developed. So typically when you talk about the history of the reservation system, you start roughly in 1830 with Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. However, for today I'm going to start a few decades beforehand in New Jersey, specifically in 1758 with the Brotherton Indian Reservation. This is, by all accounts, the first Native American reservation to exist in what would become the United States. And in my opinion, this is the closest a reservation will ever get to setting out to succeed in the goals that it was designed for. So Brotherton was created in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, or the American Indian Wars as done here. Basically, the British colonizers decided that there were too many people living in the colony of New Jersey, and that therefore someone had to go. And they'd rather the Native Americans left rather than their own political subjects. So they signed the Treaty of Easton, which, with the Brotherton natives, as they were called, meant that the British Crown would cede some territory in the Pennsylvania colony. In exchange, they would leave and they would go settle those lands. Now, for the most part, the Brotherton natives saw which way the wind was going and peacefully left. However, as we'll see again and again throughout this part of the lecture, there are some amounts that decide to stay in their ancestral homelands. So the British colonizers decide, we're going to set aside this little township, the Burlington Indian Reservation, for you to live on, and as long as you accept Christianity and become, Christians and civilized, we don't care. And this works for about 30-odd years. Native Americans basically co-opt Christianity into their traditional religions, and they live peacefully with white neighbors who don't really care. There's plenty of land, and hey, at least they're civilizing. But especially after the American Revolution, what begins to happen is more and more people come into the New Jersey colony, more and more land is needed for these people to live on. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to take over this little native town that really there's no resistance to. So no one knows exactly when the last natives left Brotherton. However, the symbolic end of the reservation comes in 1801 when the church that the natives had been using with their missionaries burns down after it was used by the white population for about 3 to 4 years. So Brotherton collapses. This is the first attempt at an Indian reservation, and it's probably the best because it doesn't end in violence or bloodshed, just pressure to leave, and things will only get worse from here on out. Which leads us to, of course, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 to 1841. Now, this is perhaps the most infamous part of Native American history. It is ethnic cleansing by all accounts. And it doesn't just come out of nowhere. This policy was built up over decades of American foreign policy towards the Native Americans. President Washington and Jefferson made treaties with the natives, which sometimes had natives move westwards, but that was more of a voluntarily made decision rather than one made by force. Washington and Jefferson would have rather had the natives civilize and assimilate into the white dominant culture than to use force. Jackson decides, once he gets into the presidency, to escalate things. It's taking too long. We need this land for white settlers. Just force them on. Now, that's not to say that Jefferson and Washington were these paragons of virtue and that they didn't want anything bad to happen to the natives. No, the goal was always destruction of some kind. It's just that Washington and Jefferson were willing to have it go on a long time and be more of a cultural obliteration rather than the physical obliteration we see under Jackson. However, Jackson does come to power, and we begin to see the Indian Removal Act. Now, there's a plethora of court cases that basically make this whole thing defunct, but it still goes through anyway. The Indian Removal Act targets mainly the 5 civilized tribes, along with other groups living in places like New York, Ohio, Michigan, but it really decimates these 5 people: the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Cherokee. These were 5 native nations that attempted to civilize themselves so that they would gain the respect of Washington and that they wouldn't have to be destroyed. Unfortunately, that does not work out at all for them. The Chickasaw are the first to face any sort of backlash. When they signed a treaty of Dancing Around the Creek, which is probably the most lenient treaty signed between Jackson and Native Americans of this region. Basically, they say, you can leave, we'll let you survey the land, we'll let you appoint your own delegates, we'll protect you, you'll be autonomous, and we'll make sure you get there safely, and while you're waiting, you'll be protected by the American government. Well, of course, none of these promises were honored in the short term or the long term. 4,000 die on the Trail of Tears, on their section of it, from disease, and an unknown amount more die from other types of murder, effectively. And the United States government didn't even bother protecting these people while they were still living on their land. White raids were constant, and they would try and force them out on an individual level, which led to bloodshed all over the place. Now, the Creeks are kind of the other hand of the story. Chickasaw leave basically of their own volition, with some violence going on, but it's not exactly forced. The Creek are completely betrayed, far more than any nation of the 5 civilized tribes. Due to U.S. expansion, the Creeks become a confederacy, and within about 10 years of that foundation, they split between the North, which are called the Red Stick Creeks because of the red sticks they would carry into combat, who were focused on isolation from the United States and traditional ways of life, and the southern region, or what is colloquially known as the Great Confederacy, who wanted to trade with the United States and perhaps even integrate into white culture as it was. This leads to conflict between North and South, and eventually, as part of the War of 1812, it spills over into a white war. Jackson comes down with his 9th Military District, and along with elements of the Cherokee and Chickasaw nations, wages war against the Red Sticks, while the Red Sticks receive guns, powder, and bullets from the British and Spanish traders. About 1,500 Creeks will die as a result of the war itself. Thousands more will die from overexposure and hunger because of American war policies, which basically stated we are going to burn down communal farmings, villages, whatever it takes to win this war, which basically led to mass famine and starvation. White militias got involved regardless of which side they were supposedly on, just to kill and seize native land. And the most insulting part of all, perhaps, was when the war was over, Andrew Jackson forces both sides to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which forces the entire Creek Confederacy, both North and South, to cede 20 to 23 million acres of land. Not just the defeated North part of the Creek Confederacy, the entire nation has to cede this much land. And the reason he posits is because this is reparations for the war. This is what the Americans are owed because this is what they fought for. No estimate I've seen puts the deaths of American soldiers above 100 killed in action. The greatest Red Stick victory throughout the war is an ambush that leads to 22 deaths. It's insulting and absurd that this is Jackson's response to the end of the war. So the Creek Confederacy still somewhat survives, and then in 1825, 5 of the chiefs of the Creek decide to sign the Treaty of Indian Springs, which basically cedes the entire rest of Creek territory to the United States government. This was illegal by Creek law. The Creek Confederacy made any attempt to cede territory to the United States capital punishment. So when the Creek Confederacy goes to the Supreme Court of the United States and says this treaty is null and void, it should not be legal, SCOTUS actually agrees with the Creek Confederacy, and the treaty is overturned. That doesn't stop white militias and settlers from bringing the treaty to native communities and saying, hey, you've got to leave, but we'll graciously buy this land from you for pennies on the dollar and force you out. Unfortunately, by 1832, with the Treaty of Cassetta, legally the Creeks are finally forced away from their nation, and all lands east of the Mississippi are ceded to the United States. They begin a long trek towards Oklahoma that would go on to 3,500 disease and plenty more mortality. The Cherokee, Seminole, and Choctaw basically found themselves in similar positions as gold was discovered in Georgia, more and more white settlers moved in, and more people were forced from their homes. The Trail of Tears was uncharacteristically brutal compared to the rest of this history. Forced marches through all weather and all terrains killed tens of thousands of people across these 5 tribes. Old men and women were beaten by their escorts when they collapsed or began to lag behind. Children faced a whole plethora of different abuses, whether physical, emotional, or mental. And men who tried to resist, their children being beaten, their fathers and mothers being killed, were killed themselves in acts of self-defense by American soldiers. Unfortunately, rape was common among women, and sexual services was the only way to get basic supplies on these marches. And what's incredibly important to remember about the Trail of Tears is that while the numbers seem low, 4,000 killed from the Creeks, 3,500 killed from the Cherokee, the largest nation only amounted to 20,000 people. The loss of 5,000 to 6,000 people per tribe was incredibly debilitating to these organizations. And when they finally made it to Oklahoma, it made life there that much harder. And once they got to Oklahoma, things settled out for about 40 years. The Creeks, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole were promised autonomy, that the United States would no longer interfere unless to renegotiate treaties, and with a brief exception of the Civil War where more Indian territory was seized, this remained the status quo until 1887. In 1887, the United States found itself in that same old position that it found itself at the Brotherton Reservation and when the Indian Removal Act was first passed. Basically, they needed more land for settlers and populace to live on. And so where did they decide to go? Oklahoma. But this doesn't just affect the five civilized tribes. This affects Native Americans of all walks of life. However, it's particularly debilitating for these five tribes. Basically, what the Dawes Act is an attempt to civilize Native Americans by breaking up reservations on a tribe-by-tribe basis. The Dawes Act created the Dawes Commission, which would go into a Native reservation and decide how is best to civilize these savages, which oftentimes meant that their land was broken up and it was sold based on blood quantity, which would basically mean that if you were a full-blood Native American, you'd receive 20 acres of land. If you were a half-blood Native American, you'd receive up to 40 acres of land because it was believed you were better at farming, you were civilized, you were on the white side, and if you could not prove that you were a Native American, even though you lived on the reservation, your parents were Native American, and you might have even walked the Trail of Tears yourself, unless you had documents to prove it, you would become detribalized, and the United States would no longer consider you a Native American, and you would not face any protection or gain any allotments. Now keep in mind, the five civilized tribes had only recently developed the standard of a nation state, had only recently written down their own languages, and had just been through an ethnic cleansing episode. So basically, tens of thousands could not legally prove that they were Native American. And so this began another diaspora that forced thousands away from their homes and made white settlement just that much easier. In my opinion, after the Indian Removal Act, this is the most debilitating thing for Native Americans. And it's part of the reason why the reservation system today is so conducive to poverty. Now, I was looking at a book from 1991, and this was effectively the defense the author gave of the Dawes Act. They were to adopt the values of a dominant society and see land as real estate to be bought and developed. They learned how to use the land effectively in order to become prosperous farmers. As they were inducted as citizens of the country, they shed their uncivilized discourses and ideologies in exchange for ones that allowed them to become industrious, self-supporting citizens, and finally rid themselves of the need for government supervision. This was incredibly debilitating to Native American society as itself. Now, not all tribes are the same, and I can't make that claim. However, many of the five civilized tribes practice communal land ownership, communal societal practices, and with the induction of private property over the space of a year, that meant that those societal habits were broken, and that Native culture had to forcibly change towards that of the dominant society, which is something that we're still seeing struggles with even today. $1 back. So, a bit of better news comes in the 1930s during the height of the Great Depression. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt decides that instead of continuing the Dawes Act, which had been going on up until the 1920s, he would effectively try and reverse it, which is what the Indian Reorganization Act or the Indian New Deal is. It's effectively a way of rebroaching relations between the federal government and Native American reservations. It reappropriates land where there is some, and allows for more semi-autonomous regions, self-governments, and more rights for Native leadership. However, for the five civilized tribes, this did not matter, because the Dawes Act had a clause where you had 25 years to get your allotment. If you did not get an allotment within 25 years, that land would be considered up for sale to white settlers. The problem was, no one wanted to give up their land. So they refused to accept allotments, instead regarding that as their land and under the control of their tribal government. So after that 25 years, especially in the case of these five tribes, white settlers just came and bought everything. There is no reservation for any of those people, because when the Indian Reorganization Act came, they mostly focused on appropriating areas where there were tribal land grants. Nations like the Navajo, the Pueblo, the Sioux, the Shawnee, so on and so forth. But the Creeks, the Cherokee, and the Seminole never got that chance because they never got allotments because of their protests. Which is the reason why, as we get into the second part of our discussion here shortly, we will not be talking about these tribes. We will be focusing more on the general picture rather than these five in specific. Now, this isn't the end of it. Then you get the 1970s and 80s, which are effectively One good thing and one really, really bad thing. The 1970s sees the creation of the American Indian movement and for more agitation for Native self-government, Native rights, and for more and more authority to be given to Native reservations. As well, they want restructuring of federal aid and assistance to the reservations, which is incredibly important. And because Native reservations basically cannot exist on their own. They were never meant to. Reservations were effectively a way of pushing away Native Americans until it became a problem for future generations. And when it did become a problem for future generations, it was effectively a way of concentrating them and begin to assimilate them into the white culture. These were never meant to be their own areas. They're not economically independent. So that means they rely on the federal government for assistance. And then the 1980s happened, and President Ronald Reagan decided, hey, they want self-government, they want more individual rights. Well, that means that the federal government shouldn't be having to pay for them. We've humored the Native Americans too long in a speech he made in 1988 to Moscow State University. He cut block grants to Native reservations, he made it harder for Natives to collect on the benefits, and what happened? Well, massive amounts of poverty began to rise, and many of the problems we see today become more and more entrenched, and especially we'll get into that as we look at problems. So, this gets us to the general issue of reservations. They didn't exist in this patchwork of the Dawes Act, the Indian Removal Act, the reforms of FDR, the 70s, and the 80s. There is no consistency in their history effectively for them. They're forced to live in different times, in different ways, and there is no one set policy, which makes things incredibly difficult to manage for both tribes and the federal government. Their existence is effectively contradictory. Native governments are given lip service to autonomy. They're told that you get to manage your health care, you get to manage your education, you get your own police forces, you get own your mines, so on and so forth. When it really comes down to it, because of how reservations are structured, they're reliant on the federal government for all of those needs. And when the federal government takes a step backwards and decides to have a hands-off approach, that's disastrous. And it effectively means that these areas cannot exist. If you take a look, where those reservations are not great urban areas. They're isolated, they're in terrible conditions, and they weren't meant to be self-sufficient, but they're expected to be. So that's the general issue, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Talk to any Native American that has ever lived on a reservation, and poverty is a constant problem. Now, the national rate on reservations is about 28.4%. This does not paint a great picture of how bad things can be. There are some reservations, like on Standing Rock, for example, where unemployment can go as high as 60 to 70%. People don't have jobs in these areas. It's a problem. And you have to understand, there's no easy solution to this problem. There isn't one obvious thing that we can just suddenly fix and everything becomes great for people living on there. Historically, natives were given near worthless land for farming and survival. Even nations in the Southwest, where you'd expect them to have issues in the first place, thrived under these harsh conditions until they were forced away from their ancestral homelands. For example, the Navajo Long March, which took them from Arizona to parts of New Mexico, which were untenable for reservation systems, and expected them to go on and continue their lives under federal management. So first, these areas are geographically isolated from population centers, water supplies, and so on. It's hard for tribal governments to get goods into reservations, and when they can get goods into reservations, they're expensive. And that means more and more of the tiny amounts of incomes that Native Americans can receive from their jobs is spent on the bare necessities of life, making any sort of economic gains nearly impossible. Second, there aren't many economic opportunities for natives. Generally, most natives work in tribal governments, which can only hire so many people to do jobs that effectively pay nothing. And you might have heard of native casinos. Those are actually incredibly beneficial for Native Americans, despite the harmful stereotypes they perpetuate. Because how Native Americans handle things is instead of just having it be private profits, they're instead redistributed to make up for cutting of social programs. However, casinos only exist on a handful of reservations. They can't provide jobs on every single bit of tribal land. And if they're not working in tribal government or in a casino in a few rare cases, a lot of the time they're making tourist goods that for us to buy when we go past their lands, which, as you probably know, are cheap to buy and don't really subsist and supplement lost income from having a normal middle-class job. So neither profession pays particularly well. Government programs designed to help prop up Native Americans oftentimes outright fail or don't gear nearly enough to offset challenges. The temporary assistance for needy families, TANF in particular, has proven ineffective as those that cannot find jobs are cut off after a certain amount of time. And when you're hunting for a job on a Native American reservation, it's nearly impossible to get one. So when that money runs out, it becomes even harder to look for a job, and thus it continues to perpetuate the cycle of poverty and dependence on the federal government. Taking Standing Rock again, for example, 17% live in extreme poverty, which is a UN designation for you are unable to post bare necessities that is necessary to live your life comfortably. While only 9% of the population on Standing Rock receives substantial federal aid of any kind. So there's a disconnect there between the extreme levels of poverty and what the federal government is willing to do in order to assist these people. And as we've discussed, these aren't meant to be self-sufficient. They aren't meant to be these grand industrial zones that are able to produce plenty of wealth and commerce. They're there as a band-aid issue, as procrastination, effectively. Furthermore, sociologist Gary Sanford puts that reservations are the first underclass areas, which are the worst off areas in the United States, due to an effect known as concentrated poverty, where due to the prevalence of poverty, crime rates raise, which force companies that may be interested in moving onto Native American reservations away because of the problems. Unemployment becomes rampant, as we talked about with things like welfare, where it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of prophecy, and education attainment is much lower. And speaking of education, that is also a key problem. Education has always been used as a weapon against Native Americans. Historically, that fact is undeniable. The boarding school process had the double negative effect of, one, ineffectively educating natives. Rather than receiving a decent education, they were basically told how to be white, which, when you're trying to get a job or trying to move on in the modern world, isn't exactly something you need or really helps you with trying to build your life. And it also fosters resentment against forms of traditional and formal education. To put it simply, Western education is synonymous with cultural destruction. So many Native families don't want to send their children to school because they're afraid that when they come back, they won't be the same people that they are. They won't be in touch with their ancestral traditions, and they'll be forced into a culture that they are not a part of. Furthermore, there's also a plethora of problems. Part of the federal government's promise as the protector of Native Americans is that they will assist in providing education to Native Americans. We've already seen how the boarding schools are a disastrous consequence of this, but the Bureau of Indian Education, which is the government oversight committee that's supposed to handle education for all Native American youth, is a laughable joke of a government institution. Basically, they're supposed to be running Native American schools. However, most natives rely on public schools within the counties that their reservations are next to, which fosters resentment between white communities and Native American communities, where white communities are unwilling to spend on programs Native students need, or even allow Native students to go to those public schools, for example. And when there are Bureau of Indian Education run facilities, they are awful. I'd like to make reference to the Crystal Rock boarding school in Arizona. Crystal Rock boarding school for the Navajo is a particularly disastrous one. The school has been described as tucked into the desert hills on a Navajo reservation 150 miles east of the Grand Canyon. Crystal Rock has cracks running several feet down the wall, leaking pipes in the floors, and asbestos in the basement. Students come from extremely troubled backgrounds, but there's no full-time counselor. Last year, A new reading coach took one look at the rundown cinder block housing and left the next day. Science and social studies have been cut to put more and more attention towards the abysmal reading and math scores, but even so, in 2013, only about 5% of students were considered to have a grade-level math skills. Many Native and Bureau of Education run facilities are little more than the traditional brick house schoolhouses that we think about in the 17th and 18th century, today in the 21st century. Simply, there isn't enough in terms of resources for Native Americans to actually get a good education, which continues to compound on the problems of poverty. The BIE also only manages about 8% of Native American students. So that means that 92% are either not getting an education or relying on public schools, which again, aren't exactly the best alternative. There's a serious lack of qualified teachers and underfunding, which continues to make this a consistent problem. And in that same vein, healthcare is also disastrous. Again, in theory, as the protector of Native Americans, the federal government has the Indian Health Service, which is supposed to provide affordable access to medical insurance and hospitals for Native Americans when they can't get access themselves, which is the vast majority of Native Americans. However, like the Bureau of Indian Education, their policies over time have shifted and changed and failed in so many ways, whereas it's a laughable excuse for a solution. They've tried everything from block grants to Native governments, to building their own facilities, to trying to get new medical facilities by private practices on Native American reservations. And that was before the 80s, when it got downsized even further, which effectively means they're unable to complete even the most basic functions of a government oversight branch. So part of the problem is that there's an inaffordability towards private practices. Hospitals can be dozens of miles away from the reservation, and they might not even take Native patients because of their lack of insurance, or simply due to discrimination and racist ideals that are still prevalent in many white communities around Native reservations. That's assuming they can afford it. There are legal issues concerning the opening of private practices on reservations. There's generally, any company trying to move on to a Native American reservation has to deal with it on the federal level, the state level, the county level, sometimes the city level, before they get to talk to any representative of that Native American reservation. So for many companies, there's no point in trying to do that because the amount of bureaucracy and tangled webs you have to get to just to talk to an indigenous person is not worth it. So there are almost no facilities actually on reservations, which means that they have to wholly rely on going to these private practices outside reservations, which have their own plethora of issues. And finally, and in my opinion most shocking, Native Americans don't get access to Medicare and Medicaid, even though they pay federal payroll taxes that take whatever little amounts of money that they get and put it into Medicaid and Medicare. Now legally, yes, they are supposed to get this. However, in actuality, the management of these social programs on reservations are nearly impossible, and they're oftentimes just ignored. So that means elderly Native American people don't have access to the same level of health care that elderly people across the United States have access to. And with the continuing disease and problems for people as they get older and older, that's obviously a problem. Finally, in terms of looking into the deep problems, are the mineral rights for Native Americans. There are 326 tribes, nations, and bands living on reservations in the United States. And only one has a native-owned mining company on them. That's the Southern Uwete. Now, this has provided a lot of money for this particular tribe, and it's offset a lot of the problems that they face due to the downcutting of social programs. They're able to invite private practices for healthcare, put more money into their schools, and counseling services. Much like, as we talked about before, with the casinos, where they spread that money rather than having it be private profits. 30% of the nation's coal west of the Mississippi, 20% of known oil and natural gas deposits, 50% of natural uranium, and a plethora of rare earth materials that are necessary in an increasingly modernized world are found on Native American reservations, and yet, for the most part, they don't have access to this. Now, legally, yes, they are supposed to. Native American reservations and governments have the authority to decide how their land is used. However, in a study conducted by the Department of the Interior, they found that if you are trying to open up, let's say, an oil rig on a Native reservation, you have to go to from anywhere to 3 to 6 different government oversight committees and over other types of bureaucracy. Whereas if you were to take 2 steps off that reservation, it would be only 1 to 2 different bureaus and committees. So for Native Americans who already are stripped of cash, time, and resources, to go through a legal battle of going through half a dozen different bureaucracies, it's simply not worth it for them. And so while they legally, yes, do have the right to do this, they, in reality, can't. And that means that wealth that should be spreading to Native American communities simply doesn't. Now, I don't have a conclusion slide, so I'm just going to talk to wrap this up for everyone. The problem for Native Americans is that the reservation system has historically not been something that is made for self-sufficiency. It has been made to assimilate and force Native Americans to renounce their practices. We've seen this with the Dawes Act, and even under the Indian Reorganization Act, there are still elements of that going on. Since the 1980s, Native Americans are caught in this awkward space between relying on the federal government because Native reservations are geographically isolated and can't produce their own economic opportunities, and expected to manage themselves because that's what the treaties and the presidents have said over decades and even centuries. So where does that leave Native Americans? In poverty, undereducated, without the opportunities that you or I have, dying of diseases that we should be able to combat effectively in the 21st century. That's the problem with reservations. They are conducive to poverty because they are inherently a contradiction of American policy at the federal level. Thank you. So if there's any questions, I'd be willing to take them at this time. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there are several nonprofit and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that have been trying to get Native Americans to mine on their lands. However, I didn't get into this. There's also the problem of natives and their traditional beliefs of ecology. But there are some resources, but they're severely limited, I'd say. All right, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Cameron. And thank you, Aaron and Roberto, who did our student-led discussion last week. So these are our 2 student-led discussions that we had for our Native American Heritage Month. And I'm so very glad that they wanted to do this and was an opportunity to be able to have these student-led discussions. Next week we have a discussion led by Wayne Stroke, who's the advisor of the Association of Native American Students. Cornhusk, we got a busy week next week. Cornhusk workshop on Monday. Thursday is the discussion, and then we have our film called Warrior Women, featuring Madonna Thunderhawk's story, and the talk is, with that is going to be held by Corinne Fairbanks, who is the local leader of the American Indian Movement chapter here in Southwest Ohio, so she will be here on Friday. And then we will have our book discussion after we come back from the holiday break. So I invite you all to still check out. We still have a full schedule coming up for the next couple of weeks. And I want to thank again Cameron, Aaron had to go to class, but Cameron and Roberto for having these student discussions for this month. So thank you for coming.